Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event this evening with Scott Shepard in conversation with Julie Clark discussing The Last Commandment. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is Thursday, July 21st, this Thursday, with Zakaya Delilah Harris in conversation with Glory Edom, discussing The Other Black Girl. Support our bookstore and our authors by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click the green purchase button that reads The Final Girl, just click the purchase button that reads The Last Commandment directly below your viewer screen. Tonight's books will come signed, so if you order a book, you will receive it signed. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process. We're selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro.fm and Kobo for those who are interested. A little more about Scott. Scott is a veteran writer and producer and showrunner with years of experience running network series. His production and screenwriting credits include The Equalizer, Miami Vice, The Outer Limits, Haven, and Quantum Leap. Born in New York City and raised in Los Angeles, he currently teaches television writing at the University of Texas at Austin. The Last Commandment is his first mystery novel. Now a little more about Julie. She is the New York Times bestselling author of The Last Flight, which has earned starred reviews from Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, and Library Journal as well. And the New York Times has called it thoroughly absorbing. It's been named an Indie Next Pick, a Library Reads Pick, and Best Book of 2020 by Amazon editors and Apple Books. Her debut, The Ones We Choose, was published in 2018 and has been optioned for television by Lionsgate. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Scott and Julie. Enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Hello. All right, Scott. So I'm just going to dive right in. First of all, I loved the book. Oh my gosh, what a page turner. And the ending, I'm not going to do any spoilers, but anyway, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book? Give us a little bit of your pitch.
Okay, it's about The Last Commandment is about. It starts with about a Scotland Yard commander named Austin Grant, who's in his 60s, and he literally is in the last 3 weeks before he retires. He's had a pretty rotten year. His beloved wife, Allison, died of cancer a year before, and he's really been grieving, and life isn't the same. He's sort of had it up to here, and with solving cases, and doesn't really care about it that much anymore. And what's also led to his, sort of not being unhappy, he's also been estranged from his daughter, Rachel, who's a reporter who lives in the United States. And just when he's trying to get out, I like to say it's kind of like Al Pacino in Godfather 3 saying, just when I want to get out, they drag me back in. He's embroiled in a series of murders, and the book starts with the third in a series of murders that very quickly on the first few pages of the book, they realize are being done according to the 10 Commandments. And so he's figuring out, like, okay, there's some maniac killing according to these people. The fourth commandment is thou shalt not work on the Sabbath. He thinks, who works on the Sabbath? He thinks about priests. He closes down every church in London and figuring this guy's going to kill a priest. Nothing happens. He goes to bed, and in the middle of the night, he gets a phone call from a young New York cop named John Frankel, who's standing in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, where he is standing next to a body of a priest who's hanging, from the altar with the Roman numeral 4 etched in his forehead. And that sends Grant across to New York, where he has to work with Frankel together in solving this case. And along the way, the other person that he gets to re-engage with is his estranged daughter, Rachel. And the story is of the three of them dealing with each other and trying to solve this case. It has a sort of globe-trotting nature that starts in New York and eventually ends up back in London and other places. And it's a fun puzzle with, I think, a lot of emotion and other stuff.
So, okay, I have all these questions for you, right? Here are my questions. But I'm going to backtrack because something in what you just said made me wonder, why did you start, the writer in me needs to know this, why did you start with the third commandment? Like, as a writer, I'm super curious about why didn't you start with the first one? What is the first one? Thou shalt not kill? No.
The first one is thou shalt not have any other God but me, right? Okay. It's funny, I've had this idea a long time, it's the back of my head. I originally thought it was a movie idea, never wrote a word of it. And I always had the opening scene in it, which was that the third commandment is, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. And I always had this idea. Back in the day, it really was kind of like a Sex Pistols knockoff band. The lead singer is strangled with a guitar cord, and the name of the group was called the Blasphemers. That much I always had in my head. Okay. And I also think it was a really evocative way to start. And I wanted to get it going. And plus, I didn't want to have to describe 10 murders through the book. And I figured at some point it was easy enough prologue to backtrack the other two things. And I think it turned up the jets on it too. I wanted him to know that there was a maniac out there who was a serial killer right from the start, where you wouldn't know that from the first one.
You wouldn't. And so you already have those two murders under your belt where they can go back and be like, that's what that was. Mm-hmm. So that was really smart. Interesting. So tell us, you kind of hinted on this a little bit, but tell us a little bit. So you decided to hinge all of these murders on the 10 Commandments, and you're saying that you've had this idea for a long time, but really tell us a little bit more about how you come up with the idea of, basing murders on the 10 Commandments. Tell us about that.
Well, I think there was just two, again, it's kind of strange because the idea was in my head for so long. I don't know exactly where it came from. I think there was two things. One was the idea of creating a case for two fish out of water, like a London cop, going to New York and dealing with a New York cop. And I think originally back in the day, 30 years ago, it was sort of on the heels of the Lethal Weapon movies. And then I was thinking, okay, you have the kind of staid, quiet, older cop like Danny Glover, who could be this Scotland Yard guy in the day, would have been like a Sean Connery. And then you had this kind of young hotshot in his 30s at the time, Robert De Niro. So I had these two characters in mind. And then the first serial killer book that I ever remember reading before Silence of the Lambs, there was a writer named Lawrence Sanders who wrote a series of books. One was called The First Deadly Sin. It's a great book. It's about a maniac killer who kills people according sort of to the 7 deadly sins, way before 7. They made a movie of it with Frank Sinatra. So, and then this guy also wrote a couple other books. One called The 8th Commandment, and then one called The 6th Commandment. There were standalone books. There were mysteries that thematically, if it was the 6th Commandment, thou shalt not kill, that's what the theme of it was. It was the 8th Commandment, was thou shalt not, but it was just one at a time. I said, what if you did all 10? And what it gave me was a roadmap to do a puzzle, way before the Da Vinci Code, way before all those before 7, because it sort of allowed me to do a puzzle, which it's pretty easy for me from all the television work I've done, the thousands of murder mysteries I've read and taught about when I was younger. And it allowed me to really kind of just do a story, which is really about these 3 characters who I'm planning. I just finished the sequel to it, and it's coming out a year from now, and it's about these same characters. So it allowed us a great jumping off point that it had this engine going right from the start.
So what research did you use? I mean, first of all, it's very theologically based. And also, you go from London to New York to back to London, then you're up in the Swiss Alps. So tell me, did you do any research? Talk about that.
Well, I kind of remembered what the 10 Commandments were from reading. When I was a kid, I remember there was a market here called Food Giant with my mom. It was one of the few times I ever go shopping with my mother, and they had these books they came out in 10 parts, and they were Old Testament Bible stories, but it was like reading fairy tales. I mean, that's what it felt like to me. A guy ends up getting swallowed by a whale. A guy cuts his hair and he's not strong anymore. Somebody comes down from the mountain. These are the 10 Commandments. So I always kind of remembered those ideas. I didn't know what the order. I literally had to remember saying, okay, I knew what the first couple were. I know what the last one was. So I didn't do much more research than that. And then in terms of London versus New York, I spent a bunch of time over the years in New York. When I did the Equalizers in New York, I always loved the idea of London. But one of the nice things about waiting to write this book was 30 years ago, I'd never been to London. I just loved the idea of it from being a writer and Sherlock Holmes and Dickens and all those things and the idea of it. But since then, starting in 2001, we went to London for the first time. And my wife and I just loved it. And I've always said if I was going to live in a different city, that's the city I'd love to live in. So by the time I got to writing it, I felt like there half a dozen times and prowl alleys. The first thing I ever did when I went was I went and took a Jack the Ripper walking tour. That was the first thing I dragged my wife to, because it's just, that's what I was sort of interested in. And it's translated. So I created my own serial killer who's traipsing through London.
Your life is lucky. She's very lucky. So, okay, there are some grisly murders in this book. They can be graphic. They can be a little scary. How do you write those? I mean, I'm asking personally, this is not like a writer question, but just like, how can you write those and not be totally traumatized?
Okay, well,
are you desensitized by, like, when you write it, because you're creating it, do you become desensitized to it? Do you think?
A little bit. I think part of it is, like I said, maybe it's something surrounded by the thousands of murder mysteries and thrillers, including your wonderful book, which was not bloody or gory. It was just very twisty and turny and very character driven. But I kind of feel sometimes, what's the karma of living my life in a room surrounded by probably tens of thousands of murders, and it just probably, has caused me to maybe be desensitized, like you say. Also, I've worked on a lot of genre shows and a lot of mysteries and thrillers. I've written a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
but I've never been one. There's sometimes brutal, but I like to think there's a little bit of a wink in the eye in terms of the murders. Just the fact that the first murder is literally a guy a rock and roller who was strangled with his own guitar string, and the murderer walks away whistling the song of the guy's one hit. So that's more interesting to me, the irony of that, as opposed to literally focusing in.
Right.
Like, I love horror movies, but I have a hard time watching something like Saw, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's the idea of what you don't see is much more horrifying. So I'd like to think I don't dwell on that. Some of the bodies show up after the fact. So that's kind of the way I kind of get around that, I think.
That makes sense. Yeah. So, you have been a TV writer for a long time.
Yeah.
Long time. How do you make the leap from TV and movies to books? Like, what are some things that are unique to TV and movies that aren't in your book writing? And what are some things in novel writing that you had to learn because it's not something that you use in TV movies?
Well, the first thing I've always said, I've said this a number of times over the years, and recently now talking about the book, I always said that, and actually I wrote a little piece today that we're publishing somewhere, that television, what I learned really quickly was that it's not a radio show. You literally have, it's there in front of you and you can hear it and you can see it. As soon as I started writing books, I kind of realized, wait a sec, it is a radio show, and you have to take the place of all five senses. As somebody who also really always prided myself in the narratives of stuff of my scripts, I like to be very descriptive. I'm always moving the camera around. Where it's literally, the way I would write my television scripts would be that I would describe what was going on, and I literally would move it to a character, etc. Well, now it sort of became a natural progression to kind of make it really more prose-like. And what happened over the years, I had the privilege of getting to work and adapt a bunch of really terrific authors' work, starting with Stephen King. We did a couple shows, The Dead Zone and Haven, and then Harlan Coben I met, and we did we developed and sold a pilot that didn't go, but I got to work with him. And one of the things we did, as somebody who would kind of normally not write outlines, didn't like writing them, I would literally write on a piece of paper. But all I needed to know was like, you're in a bar, argument, kiss, death, over. And I could figure out the rest of it from that. I started writing these really long, detailed outlines in prose, including for the Harlan project. I wrote a 45-page outline for a 60-page script in a prose form in Harlan's style, and really liked it. And I started doing more and more of that. And the pilots I would do subsequently with my partner, Cindy McCreary in Texas, I would do these first drafts. Literally, I'd write the script in prose, and I felt this yearning to be able to kind of describe and use all five senses. And then it allowed us to kind of do the script. So that was something that, was a natural sort of transition. Plus, I love these books. I've always loved these books. I read these writers that I collect where, like I'm looking at Michael Connelly's books, right? I have all 30 of them. or whatever, first editions. I read the first Harry Bosch book. Yes, the plots are great and cool, but I'm interested in watching how these characters progress. It's sort of the great thing in television too. In television, we invite these characters into our house.
Yeah.
Is what we end up doing, and because that's why it's called series television. So the idea was always to kind of find a series that I could write about characters that I want to keep revisiting.
So are you going to write the adaptation for TV?
One day, maybe. I'm in no rush to. At some point, I think the idea would be this book. I think me and my agents here and the people I know, we've all thought it would be a really kind of good binge watching 6 to 8 episodes, and the intention would be each book, because it deals with a seminal event in these characters' lives, and usually mystery and murder and mayhem surround them. The idea would be each book would be something that could be an episode, a year of a television series. But I figure that'll catch up with us, and yeah, of course, I'd like to adapt it. I think the nice thing is sometimes in Hollywood, I know a lot of writers who are, authors who haven't had the ability to work in television. They're paired up with people like what I do. They run shows, they create shows, and they have to yield to them. And they do, and you work in conjunction with them. I've always been honored to work with any novelist, that I get to adapt and try and be as close to those original pieces as possible. But so when it comes to people, somebody asked me the other day saying, well, maybe if you want to do this, we could bring another, younger writer to kind of adapt the shows. Would you be willing to do that? I said, I don't know. We'll get to that. But the difference is I've been doing that for 30 years. I know how to do that. I probably would like to do it. I don't want to do it by myself because it's a crazy job. But I would probably adapt them too.
So what authors have you loved collaborating with?
Well, obviously, I think because he's the other one of my heroes. I mean, Stephen King is one of them. And Haven. He wrote. There was a book called The Colorado Kid that he wrote for Hard Case Crime, Charles R. Dye's series of books, and it's just a 180-page novella. And he was gracious. The writers I worked with who created, and we kind of got it on the map. We did an adaptation of taking this 180-page idea and turned it into a show that ran for 7 years. And the fact that it was based on a Stephen King thing, it always had the mood of that, the Dead Zone the same way. That was great. Harlan was absolute fun. And then the other person I had a great time with, and her book comes out tomorrow, is Karen Slaughter.
Oh, yeah.
And Karen was just,
Which book of hers did you do?
We actually sold and adapted, it never got made again, were the Grant County books, the first 6 she wrote.
Oh, yeah.
About Sarah, Jeffrey, and Lena, and they were great. She's a great writer, and she's one of the funniest people I've ever met, and a great writer and a great person. So we would just have a hoot just doing the things together, so it's fun. I mean, writers are my favorite people. My best friends are writers,
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
So this is a question that I always get asked, and I never really know how to answer it because I think for me it's different at different phases of the writing process. But do you like to outline your novels? Let's go back to novel writing.
Yeah.
Did you outline The Last Commandment, or did you just go?
I didn't outline it. No, all I had was I knew. Who was it that's telling me this the other day? I was talking to Wendy Walker was telling me, and I'd heard this term from my old partner Dan Pine, was asked about it, about being a pantser, like to write like a pantser, which is like by the seat of your pants. And I've been doing it increasingly. I mean, my first I wrote 2 novels a few years ago. Both were based on scripts. The first one was a noir horror novel that the first third of the book was the script. It was a pilot that never got made, but I didn't know where it was going, so I had to make up the other 2/3. I didn't outline it; I made it up as I went along. The next book, The Seventh Day, which was a apocalyptic western, was a 60-page script that I turned into a 500-page novel. So I figured out how to. They almost been made 5 times, and now we're maybe getting it made again. But the funny thing was, I was able to develop the characters that way. In this, the only outline I had going for myself was I knew the opening. I knew who did it, and I knew where it was going to end, and I knew that there were going to be 10 commandments. But after the priest murder, the 5th murder is, thou shalt not honor thy mother, thou shalt always, honor thy mother and father. Well,
that one was a silly.
Well, and the funny thing about that, honestly, Julie, was that I had no idea. I said, everybody has a mother and father. Who's the victim? How's it going to work? I had no idea. I thought about it as we went along. And here's what was interesting about movies and television versus writing books. A really great guy, a guy named Michael Piller, who is a terrific producer, writer, showrunner, who created The Dead Zone and a bunch of the Star Treks, Voyager and Deep Space Nine. His son co-created Dead Zone, and Sean, his son, is a good friend of mine, and we've done shows together. And Sean always used to say that his dad, when he was writing television, used to say he would write a scene with two characters, and the characters would tell him what was going to happen next. And I said, there's no way that I could do that in television, because first of all, in television, you have hundreds of people dependent as a collaborative process, needing to know where it's going, what you're doing. That's why you have to give them an outline. You got to tell them they're prepping, etc. When I got to novels, I kind of went like, wait a sec, you can't do that. And what's really, I'm really proud of in the sequel to this, I literally only had the first 6 pages in my head, and I didn't know who did it. I didn't know why they did it. And I didn't figure it out till 100, 150 pages going in. But I think because of all the books I've read, I feel like structure is something that's pretty simple to me from running all these television shows and being the story guy. I feel like that's something I just kind of sort of say it's a North Star that if I get too far off of it, I'll know it. I also have this thing. My wife goes like, "What are you talking about?" I literally say, "I have this thing in my head." It's a cross between, these are really old references, but that paddle with the red ball that literally bounces off, the paddle. And then there was like the Pong game, the first video game, right? It's like there's a steel plate in my head, and if I start hearing something where it feels like that ball is hitting the thing and can't get through the wall, I'm going like, that's somebody telling you you're going down the wrong road, and I depend on that. And then the last thing I do is I literally like get in the shower where like the great ideas come, and I think it's literally the water hitting the top of my head that sort of frees me up. And literally I feel like I don't panic. I just figure it's going to come. I've been doing it long enough.
It really does. Yeah.
Right? How did you write The Last Flight? What did you know in terms of like?
I mean, I knew the ending. I knew the ending right from the beginning. I have to know the ending in order for me to be able to write toward something. I have to write toward kind of those major turning points. So I generally know my midpoint. I kind of I have to have an idea of like how things are going to shift and change, and then I always know my ending. But and if I don't, then I just kind of write in circles. I'm like a dog chasing its tail.
Yeah, no, I think signposts are a really great thing to have, right? Like in this piece, I always knew that the first half would be in New York and the second half would be in London. How they got, like, what drove them back to London, I didn't know until I got into the book. And it just felt like the natural sort of thing. The great thing about writing novels this way is the pleasant surprises.
Yeah.
I mean, like in the book that follows us, like literally they're characters who develop who are going to be in future books. And I get to the end and I'm going, oh, well, this person can do this at the end of this book and in the next book. And I didn't even know who that person was when I started. You can't do that in television.
You don't think you can do that in television? I mean, I think that happens in television all the time.
Well, but not
running series.
Well, maybe a little bit, but not, but not as it goes along. I mean, the person who would do that all the time, and he's a genius, but would drive, and there's millions of stories. David Milch, who NYPD Blue and Deadwood. He literally was always coming down to the set with, here's some new pages of the actors would be tearing their hair out because they spent 3 days figuring it out because it just occurred to him. He was writing those books, those shows, especially Deadwood, like a novel.
Yeah.
Right? And that's great for us who only have to deal with a publisher or a deadline to get the whole thing. But when you have literally everybody from actors, directors, studios, and people spending money on sets, and he goes, no, it's a little harder to do that.
Yeah. No, I would imagine so. I mean, the thing about writing is it's very solitary, and so you really only have a few people who are kind of counting on you. And it's much different, I think, than when you have a whole writer's room full of people needing you to tell them what to do. So, how did you make that leap? I mean, so you get questions all the time. I'm sure you get questions. I get questions like, how did you get your first novel published? What did you do? Did you find an agent? How did that work? And I'm super curious because the story that I would tell is different than the story that you would tell. So I'm super curious to hear about how you, the, esteemed television writer who has, decades of experience writing in Hollywood, how did you get into this other lane? Like, what were some of the moves that you had to make to step over?
Well, I think a couple things happened. One was I think the biggest thing was working with these other writers like King and Harlan, and especially Karen. And Karen's agent, Victoria Sanders, who I became, very friendly with. Karen said, if you ever decide to write something, I'll show it to Victoria. And then what happened is, it's always, I'll never forget. I was like, my wife and I were on vacation, and my sister-in-law called us up and said, hey, she was watching Modern Family, and the episode had been dedicated to a friend of ours who died, it turned out, and a pancreatic cancer in his mid-50s with 2 teenage boys, leaving behind his wife. And I'd remembered that I'd lost touch with him, but we were really good friends, and I think I helped him get jobs, and he worked for me as an editor and associate producer on shows. And I remember he'd called me like 9 months before, and we'd just come back from a trip, and I hadn't talked to him in a while. I forgot to call him, and it just ate away at me. I felt horrible that I hadn't talked to him. And I literally the next day said, you know what? You've always wanted to write a novel. You don't know what's going to happen next. Do this now, And so I wrote this book, and then I asked Karen if I could send it to Victoria, and Victoria read Descending Sun, that noir horror novel, and she really thought it was great and really fun. She said, could do some editing. And she said, you have this style, you could have like a James Patterson career, because you have this sort of,
you do, yeah,
kind of like knowing how to write 6-7 pages and turn you to the next one. I said, oh, well, that's unbelievably cool. And so that's how it started. And so I signed with her at the time, and we did the first 2 books. And then, so that's how it started. And then I'd written the prologue to this book about 5 years ago. And it was right around the time my father died. And I was really busy until, so I just put it away. And then I'd forgotten about it, and I just couldn't get back to, because I was so busy in television. And then a couple years ago, somebody said, what happened to that? Weren't you working on your London cop, New York cop thing? I said, yeah. So I went and I just pumped it out, and then I had this manuscript.
Now, when you are editing and revising, kind of what's your process through that?
My process is like the first draft is literally, I kind of call it like the kitchen sink version. Like, just, I tell writers I work with, writers I teach, I'm saying just get it out onto the page, and it's generally always long. I think the first draft manuscript of this book was 536 pages. And then I kind of cut it down. But after I get through a draft of it, and it usually takes about 3 months. And what I do is I finish a chapter, and then I read it out loud to my wife that night. And I kind of watch her. She's like my best audience, and I just sort of see how she reacts. I mean, I get a note or two from her every once in a while. I get to see how she reacts, and also I get to hear it, and I can kind of hear if it's sort of working. And then I don't go back and correct anything. One of the great things, I have a memory.
You don't even mark it up?
No, I just remember everything. It's really a sick sort of thing that I have. It's like I remember every book and movie I've ever read, but if you tell me to do something in an hour, I'll forget. So I also don't want to go back. I want to get to the end of it, and then I figure. And at the ending, and there's nothing that I've written that's been successful, certainly the 4 novels, a lot of my screenplays, if the last 50, 100 pages don't come flying out really quickly, there's something wrong with the first 200, 300. King says he also writes really quickly towards the end. He has what does he say? It might be an on-writing. He says he has a severe attack of the gotta knows. I gotta know how this is going to finish. He's trying to finish that. So then I go back and I'm really hard on myself and tighten it up. And usually I took maybe 60 pages out. And here's the other thing. I've spent the last 30 years working in television where I'm not only editing other people's scripts. It made me look at my scripts, how to basically start taking stuff out. But I've also spent thousands of hours in cutting rooms editing. It's the only two things in television I'm really interested in, is making stories on the front end. And in the editing room, as you know, just even the editing process in novels, I can translate it. It's the final rewrite. You get it back. What happens in television, you come up with an idea. It's an impossible thing to do, is shoot a script in 8 days, make a new show. And then it comes back into the cutting room. And the way I always cut, going, I know what I want this to be. I'm not going to say, let's try this, let's try that. I will ring it this way and that way to get what I want. Well, so then what happened with this book was, I think I had a draft that was still 500 pages. And then when Otto Penzler, who runs Mysterious Press and Mysterious Bookshop, decided to publish this book, he really liked it, but he said it's long. And he gave me a couple notes for nothing really developmental. He just said, it's long. And can you cut it? So I literally put the book up here on one side and I retyped the book and took 75 to 80 pages out without changing a word of the plot, a word of the characters, just being relentlessly hard and tough on myself. And people who'd read the first version or the second version said, I don't know what you took out. It's just news script. And I'm going, okay. So that's kind of what I did.
But what did you take out? I need to know. I mean, not that I need to know, but like as a writer who also is currently trying to like shorten some things up, like, right.
Well, one of the things, and Otto will be the first time I tried to, where I repeat myself. That was one of the things. Repetition. Yeah. It's like, and I would think that I would, and he's great at this. He goes like he would, when I just went through the editorial process with him on the second on the sequel, he would go like, you already said this, and I'm going, really? I thought I wasn't repeating myself. Where I thought I was repeating myself, he with a fresh eye. That's where he was great about sort of saying, we already know this. Pretend, I'm someone who, when I'm reading a mystery, is like, how often do I have to go back and go like, who said what? Or in conversations and dialogue, I'm going, how often do you have to say he or she in terms of their names? Because I hate that when you read 7 speeches in a row and you start to lose track saying, who's saying what? Because you don't want to be doing that. So, but in terms of what I took out, I think there's one chapter in the Last Commandment that is missing. It was a 6-page chapter that was through there's a reporter. You meet early on Monty, Monty. It was this British reporter who's, kind of follows the case from London to New York. Monty Sullivan, who was through his point of view in the second half of the book. And I realized everything here is superfluous and it doesn't. So it just came right out. And otherwise I didn't take anything out.
That's the hardest thing, I think. I don't have a problem taking things out of my books. I really, really don't, because I don't ever delete them. I just put them in a different file, so it's emotionally better for me. Because then
I have the drafts over here. I didn't throw it away. Yeah.
Then I can go back and like find it again if I really need to, except for I never ever do because I don't ever need it. But the hardest part is just, the scene that you've written and really making that decision. Do I really need it? Does it really push the book forward or slow it down? And even though it's a really great scene and it might show a lot of backstory and it might show a lot of character development, does it really work for the book? I mean, is it really doing the work of what you need it to do? And that's the hardest part, is for a writer, everything's doing the work. But it's
what I thought was great about your book, The Last Flight, is that every chapter did seem to advance a kind of twisty, turny story, but there was an emotional grip on both characters, story. And that's what I kept trying to do, is that I always want to make sure you get to the end of a chapter. This is something Harlan once said to me, and I totally dug it, which was like, I want you to be really angry at me at 3:00 in the morning when you get to chapter 14 and you want to go to sleep and you put on chapter 15. So I want to make sure you come back to the next one. And I'm going, even if I'm doing like, there is a chapter, in this early on where Rachel links up with her father for the first time in the book. And I kind of use that time to really sort of backfill you about how Grant feels about his daughter from the day that she was born. He brought her home and, she was screaming, and then she ends up, as a baby, ended up getting quiet when she heard a Beatles song on the radio, which was something I remember that happened with my little sister when she was screaming, and suddenly I Want to Hold Your Hand came on the radio, and I went, oh my God, she's at the time an American girl who like loves the Beatles, But at the end of that chapter, I also wanted to make sure that I progressed the plot forward. So, to me, you can get character and get everything, but at the same time, the story engine has to keep moving. And a friend of mine who I've worked with on a number of television shows said he knows me pretty well. He says that I know that if there's something in the book and I'm not sure why it's there, I know there's a reason it's there. And I'm pretty sure that by the time where I got to this book, there's a reason for everything it's there. Either there's a character thing, a plot thing, setting up this. I think that comes from the years of television too. When you're running shows, every decision you make creatively, you have to look at a scene, a show, an episode, the season has to go through your head. How does it inform the episode, that scene, the season, the series, that moment? And I think that's one of the things I've been able to, bring to the novel writing.
I would imagine that's very, very useful. I mean, really, that's like 90% of editing right there is that work, and it's heavy, heavy work.
That's the easy part to me. The hard part's getting the first part, on the page. It's like just getting something down, right? But then you can work with it.
Yeah,
it can always be better.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I do prefer revision over drafting.
And I also trust my first instincts. I have and I kind of hold to that. I have a writer who I love, I've done a bunch of shows with, and his first instincts are always right, but he has this thing where he wants to explore everything when we're doing it, and I'm just going like, I'm just going to start for a few days, and then we'll walk back in the room, we'll be back where we were a week ago, and I'm going, that's your process. You have to kind of go through it, but I try to avoid that because that's too painful for me.
Yeah, I find that if I am dreading rereading something, that's the first hint that I don't need it.
Yeah.
If I'm like, oh, I hate that scene. Like, then cut it.
Exactly. If you're bored, get rid of it.
Right. If you really don't want to read it again, don't keep it in. So, talk a little bit. So I always ask my students, when we finish a book, and they always roll their eyes at me like, oh God, here she goes again. But I think it's an important question to ask at the end of every book, which is, what is this book really about? Like, really, really about, And of course, your book has the plot and all of that, and the action and the killing, the murders and the this and the that. But, that's not really what your book is about. So why don't you tell us what your book is really about?
Well, my book is about these three people, and I can, I don't want to spoil the end of the book, but there's a conversation on the last page of the book between two of the characters. That's what the book's about.
Yeah.
And it's about that, and I've said this a number of times, and especially over the last year with this book coming out, and where I have three things. I keep writing about the same thing over and over and over again. All four books are about that, and most of the television shows, everything I read. I started off reading Hardy books, but quickly moved on to, people, Ross MacDonald, when I was that he was the biggest influence on me in terms of reading mysteries and thrillers, and he was always about the sins of the past. And I'm a huge, and it's taken me 40 minutes to get to Bruce Springsteen, but I'm a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, having seen him 300 times. And he, in Adam Raised a Cain, he has a line, it's my favorite line of any line of his, saying, "We are born into this life paying for the sins of someone else's past." And that's what mystery and thriller fiction is mostly about. You can go, that's why it's called Adam Raised a Cain, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I've always wanted to do is I always say, I want you to feel really good about feeling bad, and I want you to feel bad about feeling good. And because I'm at the end of the day, and you having read the book and see, I'm kind of like a hopeless romantic and a sap. I really do want to believe that good things come to those who wait. And I feel like that's the journey at the end, but you got to go through these torturous things to get there. So that's kind of what my book's about, without saying what it's about.
I think that is accurate.
Right.
Which you can't. I understand.
I
understand. Normally we have this question after we finish.
Right. It's like you and I for a second were talking about the second book. I can't talk about the second book because it deals with the first book. So you got to read that.
No, you can't. But I can tell everybody that you're going to want to read it.
Good.
So, all right. So I asked you the question, which novelists did you enjoy, adapting their novels? So I'm going to flip that script a little bit.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you if any novelist in the world suddenly became a screenwriter, which novelist would you like to adapt this book for the screen? Who would you pick?
Hmm. I'm staring at all my Stephen King books. Here's the interesting thing. Here's what I'll say about Stephen King. It's one of my favorite stories about him. I've written 3 novels, this being the 3rd, and there's a 4th. But he writes 3 kinds of novels, right? He writes Carrie and Salem's Lot, and The Stand is one of my favorite genre books of all time. I mean, I love that book. I wrote him a note and said that, to me, genre writing is really great. We love all that stuff, but you got to have a really good plot at the base of it. Otherwise, it doesn't hold up. So he wrote, he writes the horror books. Then he wrote, the Dark Tower books, which are his apocalyptic, sci-fi books. And then he wrote books like Shawshank, or stories like Shawshank Redemption. Even a book like 11/22/63 that I absolutely adore.
One of my favorites.
Well, it's such a wonderful, wonderful book. So here's a perfect part, Julie, right? That book, which is about a guy who goes through time to basically hopefully stop, Kennedy's assassination. But it's so not about that. It's about him and his relationship with that woman. It's what the TV series missed, and it just devastated me.
I know. I didn't even watch it. I couldn't watch it.
No, it was just, but the book was just so moving and so touching. And so there's a great story Stephen King tells about being in a market in Miami or something, and some woman comes up, she goes, "I know you. You're that Stephen King fellow. You write all those horror books, right?" He goes, "Well, yeah, I do write some of those." He goes, like Cujo and Carrie, and he goes, "They scare me. I don't write those." He goes, "Oh, everybody has their own, left to their own prerogative. That's fine." He goes, "What kind of books do you like?" She goes, "Well, I like books like, The Shawshank Redemption and Stand By Me and movies like," and he goes, "Well, I wrote those too." And she goes, "No, you didn't." And he was so charmed by that. So to me, there is somebody who understands, the fact that he loves Lizzie's story is his favorite book, because, he took an accident that he almost died, and it became a love story about him and his wife. So honestly, this is a book that has some maniac wandering around on 2 continents, killing people according to the 10 Commandments. But at the end of it, it's about these 3 people, and it's about heart. And I think he's always, as a popular novelist, he's been able to get to that. It's funny when they talk about, when Victoria said the thing about James Patterson, those first few Alex Cross books, Along Came a Spider and Kiss the Girls, when they really were the first ones out, and you got to get to the heart of who this Alex Cross character was. Again, they were clever, twisty mysteries, but I so cared about him in those early books. So that's, to me, what I would want somebody, to adapt my books, if that's what it was, who has that talent.
I would pick him too. Are you can you call him up and ask him? Are you
I did.
Zoom him in.
I did send him a note, about these books, and I think he's actually reading my book. I think I know he has it, and I wasn't even sure he was going to write me back, because he hasn't really talked to many of the writers. But I wrote him this novel, and he wrote me back, and it was like I wrote this letter, sort of pouring my heart and soul out to him, and I felt like I remember telling my wife, I said, I felt like in Love Actually, I was like Andrew Lincoln going up to Keira Knightley with the cue cards, and I'm like, I'm just going to tell you again. I said, it took me 40 years to write you this note. I wrote him the note, never fearing going to hear from him again. And then, if you remember, Andrew Lincoln goes out in the street, and Keira Knightley comes out and gives him a big kiss, right? Well, a day and a half later, I get an email from Stephen King, and I'm going like, oh my God, that was, I don't care whether he reads it or not. The fact that I heard back from him and he acknowledged something I wrote in that, I said, that to me was like getting the kiss from Keira Knightley. And to me, to be able to work with, novelists and be friend novelists and have them, ask them for advice and hear what they think, it's been so rewarding. Because the nice thing, look, they're wonderful writers in television, but it's a craft, more so than I think, we're writing these books. It's a craft too, but it really is. It's all about the writing. It's not about anything else.
Yeah. Well, I think that Stephen King does that really well, is that every book that he writes, no matter what the plot is, no matter what the horror is, or the apocalypse, or the ending of the world, or the creature that he's invented, there's always a core of heart to it, that third rail that just carries everybody forward. And if you're not caring about the character, then you're just not invested in the story at all. It's just plot, you know, and that's not that grows weary after a while, I think. So
well, that's what made the stand so great.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. What?
No, that's what made the stand so great. I mean, it's the apocalypse, but it was about caring about every one of those characters, be they going towards good or going towards evil, right?
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask about your main character, Grant.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk about him as if he's somebody that you've known your whole life, and you are describing him to our audience as like, you know, here are the things you need to know about my friend Grant. Like, these are important things you need to know about him before you meet him. So go.
Decent, first and foremost. Decent, well-mannered, a little bit reserved.
Yeah.
But also has a kind of wicked, biting sense of humor that just comes from when you least expect it. And a romantic, but again, everything is sort of, because it's sort of the Englishman in him, I guess it's reserved. You know, one of the shows, you know, you mentioned that I worked on years ago, where he sort of started out in my head was because I worked on the Equalizer, right? And the original Equalizer had a wonderful actor named Edward Woodward in it. Who was in Breaker Morant. And that's sort of, and I wrote for him for 3 or 4 years, and he was sort of a wonderful character. The story I've told is like, his sense of humor was, I remember telling Edward, it's the 4th of July, this weekend we're not working. You know, it's a holiday. And he said to me, he goes, "Oh, my dear lad, in England, we celebrate that day too." And I'm going, oh, of course you do. And that sort of became his sense of humor. And then the other thing, that because by waiting to this point where I'm sort of closer to Grant's age, it allowed me to kind of his perspective on life where he's at now. I haven't had the loss that he's had, but it's sort of, I kind of sort of see where he's coming from, you know, what's important to him. And whereas Rachel and, you know, Frankel are characters that, you know, are sort of the younger me, you know, and where they come from. I don't know if that answers your question, but there you go.
It does, yeah. What is Grant? I mean, like, so you're saying that he's reserved, and you're kind of telling me a little bit about sort of kind of who he is in general. But like, where is he? Like, what if we were at a dinner party and you were saying, "Okay, you guys, Grant's coming. Here are some things you need to know about him right now." Reserved, and you know, I'm going to push you a little bit. Dig a little deeper now. Come on,
yeah. I think you're going to realize he's the smartest man in the room.
Okay.
That he's going to hold his cards close to the vest. He, I would say, don't swear in front of him. He's going to be trying to figure you out. So
I hope you haven't committed any crimes.
Well, no, it's more than that. I think he's just a good judge of character. I mean, I think if you're going to try and keep something hidden from him, he's going to see it. So you might as well lay your cards out on the table with him. But again, decent is a decent man is the thing. The word decent is the thing that comes into my head. And you know, it's funny when my wife read the first book and then she was hearing the second book. And she said, "These people are really nice people, these 3 people." And I said, "Yeah." And she says, she says, "You know, you read all these books and you love all these books about these dark noir characters." I go, "Yeah, no, I love that stuff." And I love, you know, and I said, "The difference is I think it's okay here because what's going on around them is so screwed up and so dark that to me, they're sort of the light at the end of the tunnel. And I want you to root for them, you know, I mean, and they're secrets. I mean, they're definite secrets, you know, in this novel, especially as to what has kept Grant and Rachel apart. And to me, I'm only interested in these characters going forward is if there is something else I can dig and learn about their past, what they're hiding in their present, or how they react to some, you know, seminal moment, sometimes tragic, going forward. And then I think I can always construct a kind of cool, fun mystery to hang it on so you're never bored But again, it's always going to come back to what the relationship between the three of them are.
Yeah. I want to remind our audience, we have just a few more minutes left. If anybody wants to put any questions into the chat, we'd be happy to answer them for you. So give you a moment to do that. Let me look through my questions. You hit on a lot of them. What are you reading right now? Like, what are you reading and loving? While I wait to see if anybody puts any questions in the chat. Nobody ever does, but maybe they will today.
Let's see, what am I reading and loving? I'm reading a bunch of Wendy Walker's books because we've become friends and she's been kind enough to do a couple of these things, and I love her books. They've been great. I'm actually reading a book now, like that I just started, that's been sent to us, a book called Japantown by a guy named Barry Lancet. It's pretty cool, about a antiques dealer who's kind of a private eye up in San Francisco, and it got sent to me and Dan Pine about us adapting it. I mean, the problem is, I think I was saying to you, I think I've read 95 books since the pandemic started, and I have the writers that I read, I love Don Winslow, and I'd saved, one of his cartel books for now, in terms of something like that. So I have literally 80 or 90 writers, that I add to the thing, but then I meet people like Wendy and people like you, and that I haven't met, whose books I knew of, and now I'm going, great, now I have to read 20 more books of this, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I do keep a list of every book I've read for the last 25, 30 years. And what's really great, my favorite thing to do is share. I have friends who sort of say, what should I read next? I say, well, I read a certain kind of book. If you want to know, here you go. That's what it sort of is.
Yeah. So you don't really read outside of your genre?
I read pretty much three things. I read pretty much mysteries, thrillers, horror, like horror, like King. This guy, Bentley Little, who I love, that King's recommended years ago. He's written 25, 30 really kind of cool horror books. And then soft, sort of fantasy. A friend of mine, F. Paul Wilson, writes these Repairman Jack books. That's a good blend of fantasy and kind of private eye stuff. But yeah, I mean, I like, they're all character based, but I kind of read pretty much in my genre, I'm
trying to think of the one book that I could give you that would be so far outside of your comfort zone, it might be funny.
Yeah. Well, I read, one of the things that I really like, but again, it had a mystery in it. What's the book that's been on the bestseller list for the last 2 years? The Crawdad, what's it called?
Crawdads, yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, because I love the character, and it had a mystery. But it had a mystery in it. But look, I think most books have some kind of mystery.
All books have a mystery. I mean, that's the thing. Like any book, if it's written well, will be a page turner, and somebody's going to be like, that was thrilling. Right. Even when it's not a thriller.
But I'll tell you what I did start reading a lot of, maybe just as the writer in me, I did read the first 4 Zuckerman Philip Roth books, which I loved. Mm-hmm. And I've got Richard Ford's trilogy here that I want to read, So books about writers I think are kind of interesting, though I don't really want to know how they think. I might want to know how those writers think. But it was interesting but yeah, I'd love to have a book outside my comfort zone that you think I'd like. You'll have to tell me what.
I'm gonna come up with one. I'll just drive it on over to your house. I'm here. Let me think. Do you have? I just had a question. Now I can't remember what it was.
Oh, there is a question here. Let's see.
Do we have one? No, we don't have one. Oh, yes, we do. You make a lot of music references in the book. Oh, yeah. How do you use music when you write? Do you?
Yes, I have it on full blast.
What do you listen to?
Besides Bruce Springsteen, a lot of Bruce Springsteen. I was really amazed. I was listening to Carol Fitzgerald interview Laura Dave, and she said,
you hear me say Laura Dave. Yeah.
She listened to If I Fall Behind
13,000 times.
I love that version of that song live from New York City. But here's the interesting. I listened to a lot of old, like a lot of 60s and 70s music when I first started listening to music. Somebody once told me that when you're 14, 15, 16 years old, the music you listen to when you're 14 through 17 is the music that's going to inform all the music you listen to for the rest of your life. So Springsteen, the Beatles, you and I were talking earlier, the McCartney show that's on is incredible. I mean, to me, I play the piano a little, listening how those songs, there's a story behind every song. I love that. But the great thing with music is I can't write when it's quiet. I can't read with music on really, but I can write with it. And what happens is I'll have like a playlist of like 30 songs and I'll suddenly go like, what happened to those other 8 songs that I didn't hear? And I'm knowing something is good going on because I'm just zoned out. But I think keeps me going. How about you? Do you write to music or not to music?
I do. I revise to music. I don't write to it, but I revise to it. It's when I'm really kind of deepening kind of the emotion and the character and all of that I do. But I don't always, I go back and forth between contemporary music and I do a lot of like movie soundtracks.
Oh yeah.
A lot of movie soundtracks. Almost all of The Last Flight was movie soundtracks with a little bit of contemporary stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any other questions for Scott?
Well, I think the question.
How music drives your characters, yeah.
Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah. So yeah, I'm gonna hold the book up.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I could have done it.
Thanks for sending it to me.
Yeah. And read Julie's book too.
The Mutual Appreciation Society. Here we are. I'm like ran out of questions for you. I have Gretchen's questions. I have your questions. I have my questions. You hit them all. You're a very easy person to interview.
I knew Maggie was going to come on around now anyway, so we were
I know. So I'm like kind of killing time here.
This is a television thing. You actually realize you have an hour and you write to it, and we did that, which is great.
Yeah.
Perfect. That's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you again to all of our guests who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Please support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click on the green purchase button that reads The Last Commandment directly below the viewer's screen. I would like to remind you again that these copies will be signed. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, please make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Have a great evening, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie.
Bye.
Bye.